Hello, adult Sunday school leader. In the summer of 1974, that was 51 years ago, I turned 13 and my family moved from central Kansas to Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Now, there were a lot of differences that we immediately noticed, and of course, one was the humidity. I didn't think I was going to make it that first summer. I was used to dry and windy weather that Kansas has, but here in Arkansas, it wasn't as breezy and it was very muggy. Now, another thing we noticed was what was called the blue laws. Now, these were laws that prohibited the sale of certain items on Sunday. Now, I can't remember exactly what the rules were, but you could either buy a flashlight, not the batteries, or you could buy the batteries, but not the flashlight on the first day of the week, something like that. Now, I think the only prohibition is the sale of alcohol that's restricted on Sunday. Well, this week we're going to be looking at another instance where Jesus radically changed someone's life, and this time he went against the blue laws of the day. He healed someone on the Sabbath. So, this is in the unit that we're continuing. It's called All Signs Point to Jesus. This is the third lesson called The Sign of His Authority. The focal passage is out of John chapter 5, and the point is Jesus works in a way that goes beyond our expectations. Well, we've had this lesson before just a couple of years ago. It's the same except maybe for a couple of verses out of March 12th, 2023. Very similar lesson. Now, in fact, I'm just going to have to admit this to you up front. 99% of this prep talk this week is from the one I produced for that Sunday a couple of years ago. My wife and I are leaving for South Carolina at the end of this week to spend some time with my daughter and her family. So I personally won't be teaching this lesson. However, my son-in-law will be out of the country most of the time we're there, so I'll be teaching his class, and they use Explore the Bible series. Now, by the way, we did not choose this time to go because he won't be there. I promise. All right, so last week we saw how Jesus and his disciples traveled back and forth from Galilee to Judea and back and forth, back and forth. Well, in that lesson last week, Jesus and his disciples were in Galilee. Now, John takes us back to Jerusalem and records a remarkable healing at the Pool of Bethesda. Now, we're not told what feast Jesus had come to Jerusalem for, so it's probably not too important except to clarify that this was an historical event. Well, that takes us to our first set of scriptures this week, John chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. And here John describes the scene for his readers as you would expect from any eyewitness. Well, let's look at this drawing first, okay? The sheep gate. It was a gate not on the outer walls of the city, but a gate to the Temple Mount area through which sheep were brought. They were brought through on their way to be sacrificed. Now, the Pool of Bethesda was nearby, just north of the temple. This pool was discovered in the 19th century under the ruins of a Byzantine church. The archaeological evidence shows that it was a pool shaped like a trapezoid, varying from 165 to 200 feet wide by 315 feet long. Now, that's roughly just a little bit larger than a football field. And it was divided into two pools by a central partition that you see here. And these weren't wading pools. They were about 49 feet deep. That's a lot of water. Well, the northern pool, the one on the right, provided a reservoir to continually replenish and repurify the southern pool, which is seen on the left. Replenish it with fresh water flowing south through the dam between the two pools. Water probably came from the runoff in the city and some underground springs. Well, John mentioned the 5 covered colonnades. Well, a colonnade is a series of columns set at regular intervals and usually supporting the base of a roof structure. So look at this picture. Now, this isn't from the Bethesda pool or even Jerusalem. I just wanted to show from the ground up what a colonnade looked like. So how did they get the 5 colonnades? Well, it appears that they counted the 2 end walls. Okay, there's 2. 1 in between. There's 3. And then those walls on either side there that look like they're 2 walls, they probably counted those as 1. So there'd be 4 and 5. Well, if you're looking for an easy verse to memorize in the New International Version, I want to encourage you to memorize John 5:4. Okay, You'll probably see it's just a footnote. Okay, the King James records this in verse 4. It says, "For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had." Well, this verse is included in the footnotes of modern translations, but it clearly wasn't part of the earliest Greek manuscript, so it's not part of the original scripture, though it explains the situation. This verse was most likely inserted by an early scribe trying to make the reason for the gathering clearer for his readers. This explanation of healing from an angel stirring up the waters was believed by many of the sick in the city. The stirring doubtless had a physical cause, some bubbling up of an intermittent spring perhaps, but that an angel troubled the waters appears to have been a popular superstition. Well, try to imagine the area around this pool. Can you imagine what it would have sounded like, what it would have smelled like? Imagine walking down the colonnade and hearing the moans and pleading coming from the ones there, waiting to get into the pool. And on top of that, you know there had to be a bad odor coming from there, because sick people often smell bad, don't they? And then there's the question, can some of them even make it to the public latrine? So here's the thing, Jesus chose to be there, just like he chose to go through Samaria in John chapter 4. Jesus often went to those unpopular places and hung out with social outcasts to proclaim the good news. Now, is that a characteristic in which you as an individual or as a church is not like Jesus? Well, all the sick folks around the pool had just about given up hope. They believed an angel stirred the water of the pool each day at a certain time, and when it did, those who got into the pool first would be healed. But out of all the people there, Jesus selected this one person, a man who had been ill for 38 years. Now, we're not told of the man's particular problem. He's referred to as an invalid in the NIV and the English Standard Version, or one who had been ill in the New Revised Standard Version, or one who had an infirmity in the King James. The word is a general word referring to a state of debilitating illness, sickness, and disease. He seemed to have all but given up hope that he'd ever be healed. He knew he couldn't get into the pool on his own, and there was no one there willing to help him. He seemed resigned to his chronic illness, even when offered assistance by the Son of God himself. I assume that he was not merely lame, like making his way on crutches, but he was paralyzed since he was lying on a mat and couldn't get into the water very easily by himself. Well, imagine you're at this pool, and Jesus asked if you wanted to be made well. How would you respond? Yes! Why in the world would you ask a seriously ill person if he wants to get well? Yes seems to be the obvious answer, but you may know that not all sick people really want to be healed. Sometimes their sickness puts them in this place where they get lots of attention. But it also allowed the man to admit his need. The invalid in our story didn't exactly answer the question, rather he explained why he hadn't been healed. Well, let's read on. Let's look on in John chapter 5, verses 8 through 11. Jesus doesn't pray for the man. He doesn't lay hands on him. He just commanded him to get up. And the invalid was instantly cured. And it wasn't that his disease or condition was gone. That was true. But he had the strength, the coordination, and the balance to walk. And that's truly a miracle. There were 4 or 5 times in early 2001 when my wife was in the hospital for a few days because of her elevated ammonia levels, which is a result of her colon cancer that metastasized to her liver. But even after being bedridden for just a few days, she was unsteady and required a walker for those first couple of days at home. Imagine how atrophied the muscles of the man who was an invalid for 38 years, how bad he would have been off. But when Jesus healed, he healed completely and restored the man's balance, his muscles, his energy to 100%. And to me, of course, the healing was miraculous, but what I find even more amazing was that the man was not just potentially able to walk after some rehab, but that he got up and walked immediately. Well, John specifically mentioned that this event happened on the Sabbath. The Pharisees had added their own traditions to the God's law, declaring that even the tiniest violation was a flagrant disregard for the Lord. And carrying one's mat on the Sabbath was one of those added traditions that a person was not supposed to do. So the Jewish leaders called out the healed man when they saw him carrying his mat. Do you know anyone like that? A person who loves to point out the sins of others? Some churches even have that reputation. But you know that old saying, when you point your finger at someone, there are 3 others pointing right back at you. Well, yes, we need to confront sin, but we should do so lovingly, with redemption as the goal. But exposing sin to embarrass someone or to take eyes off of your own shortcomings, that's not acceptable. And here's what's crazy about that law. It was allowable to carry a man on a bed, on a mat on the Sabbath, but to carry a bed without a man on it was not. The healed man's defense was to shift the blame from himself to Jesus. Okay, the guy who healed me told me to do it. I find it interesting that the man didn't even learn Jesus' name. You know, you would think that he would have been exceedingly grateful and thank Jesus and get to know him a little bit better, but you know, not everyone who receives a blessing is thankful. You know, remember the story of the 10 lepers who were healed and only one returned to thank Jesus. That's out of Luke 17, verses 11 through 18. Let's read on. Let's look on in John 5, 17 through 20. Jesus didn't deny their accusations. In fact, he endorsed it. You know, if healing a man on the Sabbath was a sin, then the Father was to blame, because Jesus said he did nothing outside of the will of the Father. In fact, there are even greater works on the horizon that they don't even know about, even the raising of the dead. Now, there's both a physical and a spiritual meaning to Jesus' reply here. Concerning raising the physically dead, we can turn to John 11, of course, and read about Lazarus being brought back from the dead. And at the end of that chapter, we see that many people in the area believed in Jesus because of that miracle. But the Pharisees, the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, they all got together and they were amazed and angry. They admitted in John 11:47 that he was indeed performing many signs, but if they let him keep on doing it, everyone's going to believe in him and start following him, and the Romans are going to come in and utterly destroy us. So they sought to kill the man who had the power to raise the dead and who would ultimately himself rise from the dead. But Jesus also gives spiritual life as well. And while the healed man would eventually die, the spiritual life that Jesus gives is eternal. Now later in this chapter, in verses 24 through 30, Jesus further explains this. Jesus physically restored the man in our story, and I believe he continues to do so today. But not everyone who asks to be physically restored is healed. But Jesus does restore everyone who asks for spiritual restoration. In Romans 10:13, what does it say? Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Well, the lesson is about the sign of his authority. And this passage reveals Jesus' divine authority in three key areas. One is his authority over sickness. He heals with just a command. Also his authority over the Sabbath. He redefined the Sabbath's true meaning. And then third is his authority from the Father. His actions were the very work of God. Well, by performing this miracle and explaining his relationship with the Father, Jesus not only demonstrated his power, but also declared his divine nature, making this passage a clear sign of his authority. So here are some practical takeaways from this week's lesson. First of all, Jesus sees and knows our needs. You know, Jesus knew the man at the pool had been sick for 38 years and asked, "Do you want to be healed?" Well, this reminds us that Jesus sees our struggles and he knows what we truly need. In fact, he knows what we need before we even ask. Another takeaway here is that healing and transformation require action. Jesus told the man, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." The man had to respond in faith and obedience to experience healing. So similarly, we must act in faith when Jesus calls us to trust him. And thirdly, Jesus' work transcends religious traditions. The religious leaders criticized the healed man for carrying his mat on the Sabbath, and this shows that following Jesus may challenge human traditions and expectations. Obedience to God matters more than legalistic rules. Another takeaway is that God is always at work. Jesus said, "My Father's always working, and so am I." Even when we don't see it, God is actively working in our lives and in the world. We should trust in his ongoing work and timing. And fifth, Jesus acts in unity with the Father. Jesus made it clear that he does only what the Father is doing. This teaches us to seek God's will in everything we do, aligning our actions with his purpose rather than our own desires. Well, as you close out your class this week, so take some time to pray for healing, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, all those healings. Perhaps you may even list some of the first names of people whom your class knows needs healing. Well, next week we're going to be in John chapter 6, looking at the sign of his presence. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget, pray for and with your class. Thanks.